Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie. Cieszę się, że Państwo przybyli dzisiaj na otwarcie konferencji o latach 70. jako źródle współczesności na wykład profesora Klausa Opfe. Ja powiem dwa słowa na temat idei tej konferencji. Chodziło nam o to, żeby przedstawić troszkę inną możliwą historię ostatnich 40 lat. Przede wszystkim po to, żeby zmienić taki dominujący ogląd historii, który przypisuje wielką wagę rokowi 89 i traktuje go często jako rok całkowitego przełomu, rok nowego początku, rok, od którego wszystko się zaczęło. Chcemy spojrzeć na, przede wszystkim na polską historię z trochę innej perspektywy. Przede wszystkim, żeby pokazać dłuższe procesy i pewną kontynuację, która istnieje pomiędzy historią lat 70. i 80. i tym, co się działo potem. Oczywiście nie twierdzimy, że rok 89 był zupełnie nieważny, ale chcemy pokazać dłużej trwające procesy, zarówno w polityce, jak i w gospodarce, jak i w nauce, jak i w kulturze, żeby pokazać, że ten 89 jest zdecydowanie przeceniany. Żeby zrozumieć współczesność, trzeba sięgnąć też głębiej. Ale chcemy także, i to stanie się dzięki profesorowi Opfe, spojrzeć też szerzej na historię regionu, historię Europy, żeby pokazać Polskę w kontekście szerszych przemian. To znaczy, że to, co się działo tutaj lokalnie, wiązało się też z przemianami na zachodzie Europy. Teraz powiem dwa słowa, chociaż na pewno profesora Opfe nie trzeba przedstawić, ale zrobię to. Klaus Opfe jest wybitnym socjologiem zajmującym się relacjami między systemem politycznym a gospodarką. Zajmował się transformacją zarówno na zachodzie Europy, jak i tym później, jak wyglądała transformacja, czy przejście od systemu socjalistycznego do kapitalizmu. Zajmował się sposobami funkcjonowania, czy budowania instytucji. Część jego pracy jest przetłumaczona na język polski. On sam wychodzi ze szkoły frankfurckiej, ale zmierza własną drogą. Był profesorem na kilku niemieckich uniwersytetach, między innymi w Bremie, w Bielefeld i na Uniwersytecie Humboldta w Berlinie. Ja chciałbym jeszcze, zanim oddam profesorowi Opfe głos, chciałbym jeszcze powiedzieć, wyrazić wdzięczność dla Fundacji Róży Luksemburg za to, że w ogóle może się ta konferencja odbyć w takim kształcie, w jakim się odbędzie. I także Joannie Gwiazdowskiej, która jest tutaj na sali, za to, że przychylnie spojrzała na ten projekt. I także podziękować Instytutowi Studiów Zaawansowanych za to, że się zgodziło realizować ten pomysł. Now, Professor Opfe, it's your time. You can start your lecture, and then after you finish, proceed to questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
There will be some questions.
So, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this. I'm glad to be here again. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do I make myself understood? If I do not, please raise your hand.
But if you could just use microphone just in case for recording.
Oh, okay, you want to record.
Will be
Okay.
better quality.
Okay. So this is then with microphone. Also, thank you for suggesting this topic, the 70s. The title of my paper is The 70s and Western Societies, Reflection on the Major Turning Point in the History of Democracy. So this is already a hypothesis, but I was very much interested, and the longer I read about the social history and the economic history of the 70s, the more interesting it got. And this is always a pleasant experience to be invited to speak about something that I have never written about before. So it was a learning experience, which is very much appreciated. I should also say that the 70s, I'm not just speaking from what I've read about the 70s, but I also speaking from what I remember about the 70s, and the two cannot easily be separated. I mean, the mid-70s, and I'm talking about mostly about the period after November 73. And from a personal point of view, my two daughters were born in 73 and 76. My first tenured professorship was in Bielefeld in 75. So it is also full of memories, and not just studying books. And if you study books by historians such as Hobsbawm and others, of Forestier, you get a clear consensus that the mid-70s, beginning in 73, was a major hiatus, a breaking point, a rupture, a discontinuity in the democratic capitalism of the entire OECD world. The mid-70s are described as the hiatus between the golden age, the Trente Glorieuses, as the French say, the age of post-war reconstruction, or the golden age of Western capitalism, as Eric Hobsbawm called it, on the one side, and the beginning of a new configuration of trends and forces which are at the root of our present condition. The 70s are comparable in their significance to the very different rupture that occurred in the Central East European industrial societies between authoritarian state socialism and post-socialist capitalism in 1989 to 91. And it would be really nice to find a good historical study on how the two breaking points are connected, but I cannot say anything about this. Perhaps 1974, 75 had to do, or is a precursor of what happened 1989 to 91. This is beyond my means, but it is interesting to speculate about this. So it is an exceptional period in the history of capitalism, which comes to an end and a new period begins. One could also say, as some authors have claimed, the post-war period of 1945 to 1975 or 4 was an exceptional period in the history of capitalism, in that a smooth coexistence of welfare states and capitalist economies occurred, continuous growth, rather crisis-free growth in the post-war reconstruction era occurred. And only after 1974, capitalism was beginning to show its true face after this exceptional stage of continuous growth and welfare state development. And what are the features of this rupture? That is what I'm going to talk about. There is a profound, consequential, and irreversible change, both in the cases of 74 and 89. But in the West, it was not triggered by dramatic events and a sudden systemic rupture, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall was in the East. The pattern of movement is not that of a sudden collapse, but can be compared to a somewhat slower, more gradual, less conspicuous landslide. It took a while before contemporaries recognized that matters had taken an irreversible turn in the West. In contrast, the awareness of change and of the challenges posed by new conditions came simultaneously with the event in the case of the breakdown of the old regime in Central Eastern Europe. My considerations and thoughts are almost exclusively limited to the historical change that affected Western societies, whereas only limited attention is being paid in my paper to the changes in the East, as well as the interaction between the two worlds that were to remain divided for 1.5 more decades by the Iron Curtain. In order to understand the discontinuities that unfolded in the course of the 70s in the West, I shall highlight international, socio-economic, political, and cultural, these 4 families of conditions and configurations that came to an end during this period, as well as the traces and trajectories of new developments originating in the 70s, which still shape our present conditions and are arguably at the root of our present problems. The 20th century must be periodized into a first half, the age of catastrophes and world wars, or as some historians have argued, the 20th century 31 years war, from 1914 to 1945. And then, subsequently, a third quarter of the post-war boom, ranging from roughly from 1950 to 1975. The third quarter of the 20th century of the post-war boom and the reconstruction of a, as one historian has put it, society of success, which in retrospect must be seen to have come to an end in the mid-70s. The question is, what was the profile of the old condition of the 20th century's third quarter? What are the features of the emerging new? And what justifies to speak of a rupture or epochal turn, demarcating one from the other? At the reflexive level of self-description, a highly self-congratulatory self-portrait prevailed that the social sciences and political rhetoric painted of the social market economy and the economic miracle experienced by both post-war West Germany, that is the simultaneous success stories of growth, prosperity, and social security. That was the self-propaganda of the system, and it was rooted in solid facts. I mean, it was prosperity, security, and economic growth of an unprecedented continuity and size. This view of socioeconomic reality was, on the one hand, legitimacy providing and reassuring that the West would prevail over the Soviet-dominated East in terms of both economic performance and social justice. It was functioning better and it was more just than the system on the other side. And this is the Cold War confrontation that was underlying this self-description. It also entailed, on the other hand, social policy implications which were inspired by the perceived system competition or systemic competition between West and East. And the fear which was widespread in the 50s, particularly in the late 50s, although it was entirely unfounded as it was to turn out, the fear on the part of Western elites that Eastern state socialist competitors might one day become capable of outperform the West in terms of growth, social security, and inclusive prosperity. And thus, the fear that state socialism could become a politically attractive alternative to Western democratic capitalist ways of running an industrial society. So it was by no way certain, that the West would prevail and the East would go under. I mean, if you look at the exceptionally generous, by today's standards, social reforms, for instance, of old age pensions that took place in West Germany in 1957, then you see that there was a behind-the-scenes competitive motivation to outperform the East, not just in economic growth and efficiency, but also in social justice. And that was very much on the mind of conservatives like Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of the 50s. The hypothesis guiding the following consideration is that the most consequential turning point in social, economic, and political developments of the second half of the 20th century must be located not in 1989 to 91, with its blindingly dramatic ruptures, but in the mid-70s. Moreover, the spectacular changes that took place in 1989 can arguably be understood as an outgrowth and culmination of the much more creeping and inconspicuous developments that began in those years after the end of the post-war period. And these developments are still to be understood as major determinants of the economic and political challenges we face today. Let me first talk about the international system. I'll remind you of some facts in the international system that shaped the situation in the 70s. Of course, these international developments are too numerous and too diverse to be accounted for in terms of a single overall trend or tendency. The definitive defeat of the United States in their Vietnam War in April of 1975 was one indicator of change in global politics, as were the US-assisted violent regime change in Allende's Chile on the other 9/11, 1973 was the date. Followed by a military takeover of political power in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and other Latin American states, and the near simultaneous democratic regime changes in Spain, Portugal, and Greece in 1974. Within a matter of 14 months, all three regimes had collapsed. Military regime in Greece and the authoritarian regimes in Franco's Spain and in Portugal. In 1975, last cases of decolonization were achieved, the other defining global development in the post-war era, besides the Cold War. And they were the last steps of decolonization were achieved in Angola and Mozambique, which gave rise to the demise of the Portuguese regime. And there were often these decolonization events were often followed by protracted civil wars. In Angola from 1975 to 2002, in Ethiopia from 1976 to 1991, in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990, and many others, including the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. And there were also, apart from the civil wars, there were Third World international wars, Uganda, Tanzania, 1978 and 79, and Somalia, Ethiopia, 1977, 78. So a rather chaotic, unstable situation in the outside the First and Second World, left behind by the decolonization process. Now the Cold War divide between the self-described free world of democratic capitalism and authoritarian state socialism has lost in this 1970s its mental and ideological and political organizing force, or its capacity to shape global politics in ideological, political, military, and economic terms. And this organizing force had prevailed throughout the Cold War period of the third quarter, to be precise, from 1948 to the mid-70s. Richard Nixon's surprise move to visit China in 1973 was a signal event that showed that the Iron Curtain, the antithesis of the free world versus authoritarian state socialism, was not the only consideration, and it shocked everyone. As it signaled the recognition of the need to recognize by exactly the most reactionary political forces, as represented by the US President Nixon, the need to cooperate on a limited scale across the divide of the Iron Curtain. And at the same time, the German Social Democratic government of Willy Brandt created the new Ostpolitik, the Eastern policy, from 1970 to 1974, envisioning change through rapprochement, or change through détente, which then eventually resulted in bilateral agreements between Germany, West Germany, and the Soviet Union, Poland, the GDR, and the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. The final act of the Helsinki process, 1975, stipulated in its third basket, you remember 4 baskets, the third basket being the most controversial, stipulated in the civil rights basket at first largely nominal recognition of some basic civil and human rights by its 35 signatories from the Comecon, Western Europe, and the US. Helsinki, third basket, as an important stepping stone for human rights and civil rights demands in the Warsaw Pact Comecon countries. These stipulations, as well as the limited openings for travel, migration, and consumption provided through Intershop and Pebex stores and so on, these also the cultural parallels to these legal arrangements, the exchange of lifestyles and artistic creativity served as a point of reference and as stepping stones for opposition forces in the Central East European region throughout the period from 1975 until their eventual victory in 1989. In many Comecon countries, the Stalinist logic of ruthless repression of oppositional forces and ideas was de facto and at least temporarily relaxed according to some rule first formulated in Hungary, which said, whoever is not against us is for us. Without the Helsinki concessions made by state socialist regimes, it is questionable, in my view, whether the Polish Bishop Wojtyla could have been promoted in 1978 to the top of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the first time, after all, a non-Italian was chosen to become Pope in more than 400 years. And with vastly damaging long-term effects on the integrity of communist regimes, not just in his native Poland. Tensions between the state party and the Catholic Christianity and its social base were also reduced in Hungary under Cardinal Lekai in 1976. Mao Zedong's death in 1976 cleared the Chinese road to the hybrid of an authoritarian market economy that was communist just by name of the party that presided over it, while capitalism flourished in Chile under a thoroughly anti-democratic military dictatorship which held power, after all, until 1990, the Pinochet regime. And while Central Eastern European economies remained trapped in the structural rigidities and market-averse production regimes. The difference within the communist world between China and the Comecon region, this difference within the communist world may explain why the regime breakdown was only experienced in its European, not in its Chinese version. The latter managed to accomplish a remarkably robust and flexible strategy of prevention of economic crisis, which the Comecon world did not manage. Now let me turn secondly to some features of socioeconomic change that took place in the period under consideration, again the mid-70s. The mid-70s meant the end of the post-war boom, the rise of unemployment, the worst recession in the OECD world since the Great Depression of the early 30s, all with the exception of Japan, which specialized in high-tech communication-based industries, cars, cameras, television, IT, electronics. Japan and the four Asian tigers, the small states in East and South Asia, which were remarkably unaffected by the crisis of growth and employment. But this crisis of growth and employment was largely due to the oil price shock, two shocks of 1973 and 1979, and the subsequent phenomenon that at the time was called the stagflation crisis. Stagflation is the term. The external energy price shock triggers rising costs of production, rising prices and rising wages, to which employers and investors respond first by shrinking production and later by labor-saving technology and innovation, either of which, shrinking production and labor-saving innovation, was bound to increase unemployment. The end of the post-war symbiosis took place between the Fordist production regime of industrial mass production on one hand and a Keynesian policy regime where the state was responsible for built-in stabilizers through incomes policy and social policy. The crisis that started in November 1973 spelled the end of the smooth coexistence and mutually enhancing interaction between welfare state development and economic expansion, and the strength of the union, the trade unions, in making rising wages possible. Part of the incipient new production regime after 1974 involved the transition from the stakeholder to the shareholder model of capitalist finance, where the acquisition of production capital is no longer mediated through banks, as in the Japanese and German models of capitalism, but according to the Anglo-American model of stock market capitalism, with its quarterly reports. In contrast to the rapid pace of capitalist modernization that occurred in the West, the market coerced mobility, flexibility process, product and organizational innovation remained largely absent from the Comecon economies. So everything was based on organizational, technical innovation and flexibility, decentralization, the flattening of hierarchies, and the flattening of the depths of production, were Western phenomena in the new kind of capitalism that evolved since the mid-70s, and that, to the best of my knowledge, was not paralleled by anything we see in the Comecon countries. With the Soviet Union and its subordinate fellow Comecon economies being plunged into an extreme recession in the late 70s and early 80s. This recession in turn necessitated, for instance, food imports. And I remember in the case of Poland, the import of distilled water for industrial purposes. That struck me at the time as a very bad sign for the health of the economy. And it resulted in the decline of the state socialist regime's legitimacy, which was largely contingent not on political and ideological consent, but on the political and economic system's capacity to deliver consumer goods. The East Central European economies became dependent on Western economies in three ways. But you know much more about this than I do, but I've seen strong indications that this dependency applied to the dependency on Western credits. So Polish and other Comecon economies were dependent upon Western banks and Western states on credit. They were also dependent upon Western technology, For instance, the tractor factory Ursus in Poland was producing tractors that were based on Massey technology licenses, and they were dependent upon Western markets for the sales. And the idea was that these markets would help to pay off the credits by which the production had been fueled. A calculus that turned out to be not right, and I have to details, but maybe we come back to this in the discussion. Large-scale industrial change took place driven by the fusion of labor-saving technologies. Automation was the big topic at the time, made available by technological change. There were explosive advances in various basic fields of research and development, such as solid-state physics, molecular biology, space exploration, nuclear energy, and electronics, with the latter driving the incipient digital revolution in technology. Microwave ovens hitting the market in 1972, and pocket calculators, 73, were the novel consumer items. Whereas the doctrine of state socialism claimed that this socialism was the regime type providing the ideal breeding ground for what was called the scientific technological revolution. The rapid integration of this revolution into production of goods and services was to happen not in the East but in the West, in Western capitalism, as even simple means of communication, such as copying machines, needed for organizational flexibility. To say nothing about personal computers, remained a rarity with strictly regulated access privilege in the economies of really existing socialism until their end. I mean, free access to copying machines was a routine matter by the early 70s, at the latest by the mid-70s. Every white-collar worker in academia, administration and management had routine access to a Xerox machine. And I remember a colleague from Humboldt University in Berlin, East Berlin at the time, telling me how difficult it is to get even the first 30 pages of Max Weber's Economy and Society copies, 10 copies. He had to use all his connections and his power in order to get 10 copies of this chapter. The book was not available, of course, but the copies of the first chapter of Economy and Society was unavailable. That was in the late 70s. That's Humboldt University. Anyway, the crisis-induced boost of efficiency accomplished through technological, structural, and organizational modernization of the production of goods and services had, as far as I can see, no parallel at the economic base of state socialism. Could it therefore be that the combined effect of first the demise of social democracy and the political life of Western democracies, to which I come back, and second, the boom of efficiency-enhancing measures applied in capitalist democracies of the West, resulted in the Comecon economies being irreversibly outcompeted as a model of how an industrial society could be and should be organized. Question mark, and that I would like to learn more about. Discontinuities and disorganization prevailed at the micro level of social and economic life as well. The destruction of stable links between jobs, social environments, locations, skills and status. This destruction was going on. The metaphor that has been widely used since is liquidity, or the liquefaction of life courses, which breeds the attitudes of atomistic individualism and the preference for individual versus collectivist advancement. A continuous decline of union density, like the measure of of actual members to potential members in an organizational domain. Right? Union density was declining as a clear indication of the anti-collectivist turn of economic progress. The rise of consumerism, tourism, individual mobility, the car industry, leisure-related activities, the weekend, long vacations and so on, played a big role in the cultivation of individualism and atomistic views of the world. And at the expense of collectivist or collective representations through unions, works council, political parties, local and occupational milieu. International political economy, for the first time, the term of globalization came up. And the awareness of international interdependencies. Bretton Woods, the international monetary system, founded in 1944 for the entire post-war period, broke down. The monetary system with its fixed exchange rates, with free convertibility of currencies, came to an end in 1973. The consequence was the fall of the US dollar against other currencies as a consequence of the Vietnam War and anarchic conditions in currency markets. From the early 50s on, I knew, I had learned at school or heard from my parents, that a dollar is something that is worth 4 Deutschmark and 20 penny, right? This was throughout, this was a fact of life. And something that could not change, and all of us, and the British pound was 11.75. I remember. And it was true for the entire period through 73, but then it broke down and currencies began to fluctuate. And everyday discourses included international trade relations and balance of payments, and how strong is our export industry, and what do we in Britain, the slogans of buy British, right? So the awareness of international interdependency became a dominant element of the discourse. The consequence was, sales of oil were made in the declining currency of the US dollar, and at constant prices. Suppliers of oil in the OPEC organization experienced massive losses of the real market value of their commodity, which was also devalued due to global inflationary pressures. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 provided the oil exporters with a political justification for punishing Western oil consumers with drastic price hikes. This punishment consists in the reduction of oil production, the ensuing price increase by the factor of 4 within 1 year of oil, an external price shock which triggered a cost-induced recession with the then novel phenomenon of stagflation that I've mentioned. The simultaneous stagflation means the simultaneous increase of the rate of inflation, which more than doubled within the year, from 6% to 13% in Western industrial economies, and the rate of unemployment. So the debate was centered at the time around the phenomenon of the what has been described in the late 50s as the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve, if I had a blackboard, so the vertical is the rate of inflation, and the horizontal axis is the rate of unemployment. And the Keynesian assumption, of course, is that the higher inflation, the lower unemployment, and vice versa. And this is supposed to be represented by an indifference curve. Right? And now what you had in the mid-70s for the first time is not the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but both of them reaching extreme values. That is, the Phillips curve is moving outwards, right? And the indicator for that is something that at the time was called the misery index. The misery index is simply the sum total of the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment. And this reached, in 1975, 22%, whereas in the post-war period, it has never been more than 4%. Right? So it was a dramatic change that discredited Keynesianism. The Keynesians had told us we are on a stable indifference curve, and if we increase, as Chancellor Schmidt even said it as late as 1976, if we have the choice between unemployment and inflation, we opt for 5% inflation in order to approximate full employment. That was no longer true. Right? A deep discreditation of Keynesian economic policies and the parallel rise of neoliberalism or supply-side economic policy philosophy, and that was epitomized by the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976, which went to Milton Friedman. Right? So also a shake-up of economic theory and doctrine and economic policy, and that was the victory of neoliberal economic thought, which thought demand cannot be manipulated, should not be manipulated, it leads to inflation and unemployment, so let us manipulate supply, and nothing but supply, namely the supply of money. Economic policy should be reduced to monetarist supply side rather than Keynesian demand side policies. Let me continue to say something on the social structure, namely a change, of course not from one day to the other, but a creeping change from blue-collar industrial employment to white-collar service employment, from factory to finance, as it was called. The future is in the office, not in the productive shop. The experience of the tertiary sector becoming greater in numbers than the productive sector. end of a regionally rooted, fixed smokestack industrialism, consisting in mining, steel, shipbuilding. This industrialism, the old industrialism, is being exported, performed elsewhere. Shipbuilding was in a big crisis from which is never discovered, as most commercial shipbuilding was taking place in South Korea at the time, and only very specialized or high-tech ships were built in the remaining European wars. The same with steel. So if you, shipbuilding, coal, steel are fixed to a certain location. Textile industry and electronic industry can move, and locational flexibility became a method of efficiency increases. Although arguably premature, the term post-industrial society shows up in the writings of prominent social scientists such as Daniel Bell in 1973 or Alain Touraine as early as 1969. The coming of post-industrial society. Industry is no longer the logic of the economy. This differentiation of forms of employed labor has made it prohibitively difficult to think of and organize in terms of a working class with a converging awareness of what is in its solidaristically pursued common interests. Instead, there's an interesting book on the 70s by Jefferson Coe. The title is Staying Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class. New York, 2010. I think this catches something. To speak of employees as belonging to a reasonably homogeneous class becomes obsolete at the time. There is no converging awareness of what is in the common interest. Instead, the growing heterogeneity of labor, also in terms of gender and ethnicity, or race in the United States, has given rise to a labor-related as well as cultural anti-collectivist politics of diversity, of difference, and of identity that also derived apart from the movements of the 60s, the student movement. In terms of Carlo Polanyi, commodification wins over decommodification. Commodification meaning labor contracts reflecting market power, wins over decommodification meaning social rights and status guarantees. For instance, female labor power. The female life force assimilates itself to the traditional male breadwinner or bread earner life force, but the male life force is not, or just minimally assimilated to the female caring pattern. There is a low-wage sector of workfare. There is the phenomenon of the precariat, labor market integration of growing numbers of people with stagnant numbers of hours. So irregular or substandard or subnormal labor conditions become very common. Part-time is not just half-time, it can be a third of time, it can be 3/4 of time, individually tailored. It all derives from the new political economy that the 70s have given birth to. Now, political change. My third chapter is in my view, the bedrock of democratic political theory is the assumption and the normative postulate that politics has both the power and the mandate to intervene through regulation and public ownership in the creation and distribution of society's wealth and income. Whereas the opposite is not true, nor normatively defensible. the owners of economic resources and the recipients of high incomes should not be permitted or factually enabled or allowed to play a privileged role in the nation's political life by virtue of the ownership of such assets and incomes. So the asymmetry between economic resources and political power can interfere with the generation and distribution of economic resources, but not the other way around. I think this is the bedrock of democratic political theory. Needless to say, according to such a demanding standard, most democracies need most of the time to be qualified as democratically deficient. But there are degrees of such deficiency, and the mid-70s are certainly a point in time when the extent to which the economy was or could be politically governed was on the decrease, whereas the extent to which economic privilege could be intentionally or otherwise converted into political power was steeply rising. The year 1968 has brought with strange synchronicity the dramatic developments of the Prague Spring and the Paris May. Prague Spring and the Paris May, both in 68. Both were endogenous movements for revolutionary regime change, and both remained inconsequential in terms of such revolutionary change. While the former was brutally repressed by Warsaw Pact military intervention in August 1968 and relegated to the silenced memory of its witnesses, the latter, the Paris May, left behind scattered political forces widely ranging from terrorist cells to new social movements, feminist, urban, anti-war, anti-nuclear energy and other agendas, to the left liberal reformism of green movements, anti-nuclear energy movements, and parties mushrooming everywhere during the second half of the 70s and the early 80s. Yet the Western political left never managed to bridge the gap between the middle-class political radicalism of educated new left types and the blue-collar working-class organization with its often conservative, if not outright reactionary, worldviews, while social democratic and socialist political parties found it ever more difficult after the mid-70s to adopt a programmatic stance and plausible agenda for government policy that sets them apart from the mainstream of conservative and liberal competitors. The last attempt to resist the decline of democratic socialist thought and strategy was undertaken by the short-lived and largely inconsequential initiators of Latin European, Southern European leftist leaders in Italy, Spain and France, which became known for a short period in the mid-70s as Eurocommunism. Santiago Carrillo is the most important name. And some projects of Scandinavian social democrats, wage earner funds, were undertaken at the same time and in part even succeeded. But after that came something that with some exaggeration can be described as the end of social democracy. There has never been an originally social democratic notion of progress, justice, and economic policies contributing to both after the mid-70s. And today, both in the case of New Labour and in the case of the grand coalitions in Germany, the center-right and center-left parties have largely become indistinguishable. At the same time, we see the rise of public debt as a combined consequence of two imperatives. First, the imperative of cutting taxes in order to encourage investment and employment, and the imperative to spend on both physical infrastructure and social peace and social cohesion. While still governor of the state of California in the late 60s, Ronald Reagan used to lecture proponents of tax increases on large corporations about the fact that such corporations, by their very nature, are just seemingly taxpayers, he said. In truth, what they are is tax collectors. So the big companies should not be taxed because they are not paying taxes, they are collecting taxes. They shift their tax burden on their clients, who, by implication, will be the true beneficiaries of corporate tax reduction. You see the logic. Therefore, we need to lower the tax burden on corporations in order to serve the ordinary people. That was the message. The only escape from this pressing dilemma of increasing expenditures and the need to lower taxes is to rely on debt as a source of public finance. In spite of the appeal of libertarian political economists to the virtues of fiscal Victorianism, as it was called. James Buchanan is the important author, later Nobel Prize winner. Libertarian political economists insist on fiscal Victorianism and restraint. But they were not, their message was not heeded. Public debt has been continuously on the rise as a multiple of the annual GDP of advanced capitalist economies ever since the mid-70s, amounting to what today is known as the financialization of the economy. So in both Germany and the US, the ratio of annual GDP to total debt of private households, states, and enterprises, this ratio is 1 to 9. 1 to 9. So we need to work for 9 years in order to pay back all our present debts. I mean, this is mind-boggling. It was in the early 70s 1 to 4. And all this accumulated debt is the cause of our present condition, as we know. The leading doctrine of macroeconomic policy shifted its emphasis from Keynesian manipulation of effective demand to the manipulation of overall supply of money with the open and in part brutal rejection of social concerns, both in Britain and the United States, and in part also on the European continent. The authors are Lawrence Mead and Edward Banfield, who basically said the welfare state is a bad distortion, and the needy are guilty of neglecting their duties to care for themselves. Why should we care for them, as they have failed to fulfill their economic duties as well? In Germany in particular, the social democratic planning euphoria that dominated the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and aimed at a balanced economic development with monetary stability, high employment, balanced foreign trade, and adequate economic growth. That were the four corners of the magic quadrangle that inspired policy, and that was to be implemented through planning based on a tripartite or neo-corporatist consensus-building arrangement between state, unions, and employers. So that was the model that prevailed as a consensual model in the entire period from the late 60s. 69 was the social liberal coalition through the end of the Brandt government in 1974. And that came to an end. Let me skip a few things which are too specifically German here. But I want to refer to one important book, namely the 1975 book by 3 authors, one French, one American, one Japanese, a report on the governability of democracies, a report to the Trilateral Commission of Asia, Europe, and the United States. Crozier, Huntington, and Watanuki are the authors. Very important books, the first document of neoconservative backlash. And the argument, very lucid, clearly stated argument by Sam Huntington, very influential piece of social analysis, basically said capitalist democracies are ungovernable if you continue the way we have been doing so far. They undermine, due to an extreme of democratic distemper, as he put it, they undermine authority, the ability of states to govern, or as a parallel metaphor that was popular in Germany at the time had it, the state has been growing like a castrated cat has been growing. It increases in volume and size, but decreases in potency. So potency was something that is contrary to democracy, and the democratic distemper of the 60s has become excessive, and we need to do something about it in order to remain governable. That was the dramatic message of this Huntington paper, which had an enormous influence, quoted everywhere, and semi-official status. The intellectual appeal of this pattern of argument consists precisely in the fact that the rise of disruptive forces is not seen as contingent and external, but can be systematically attributed to exactly those institutional arrangements, the deficiencies of which are then exposed as a consequence of those endogenous disruptive forces, such as democracy. The demand overload that governments suffer from can be shown to be an institutionally induced and licensed, hence, as it were, in effect, a self-inflicted overload of democracies, and this must end, otherwise we become ungovernable. Ungovernability is the result of institutions overburdening themselves by triggering strategic action with which they are ill-prepared to cope. Moreover, the strength and dynamics of these disruptive forces does not allow for a smooth or spontaneous restoration of governability. Instead, what is called for are acts of major institutional restructuring. And so on. You see the neoconservative conclusions that are suggested here. There's an anti-statist, anti-collectivist, pro-market backlash which provided the soil on which neoliberalism could thrive. we see the beginnings of a denationalizing globalization discourse, a paradigm shift of modernity to post-modernity, or in the words of Zygmunt Bauman, liquid modernity. You see it in Great Britain with the end of the Callaghan social democratic government and the winter of discontent, which gives 78, 79, which gives rise to the electoral victory of Margaret Thatcher, which a most ingenious slogan of that election campaign was 4 words with 3 meanings or messages. The 4 words are: labor doesn't work. Labor doesn't work. Meaning that workers are on strike instead of working. Full employment is not to be achieved, and the Labour Party cannot run government. These 3 messages, I remember in London in 1979, all over the place, this one slogan won the elections and convinced everyone that a new age has begun. That was the message. A signature feature, and then I'm at the end of politics, and also almost at the end of my talk. A signature feature of the politics of the 70s in the West was the rise of terrorism, with in and between nation states, within nation states, Germany, Italy, and the United States. Acts of skyjacking and other violent acts of despair. As far as terrorist acts occurred in the developed countries, they can largely be attributed to desperate acts of militarized revolutionary activism and urban guerrilla warfare of elements deriving from the leftist movements of the 60s, the Red Army faction in Germany, and so on. Let me conclude by saying something about the culture after international political economy and politics, the country. There is a book by a philosopher, also remarkably influential, many thousands of copies sold, rare for a philosophical book. Robert Nozick is the name. The book came out in the United States in 1974 and was immediately translated and published in German by the publisher of the chemical industry. Unusual for a philosophical book, right? A publishing company belonging to the chemical industry. Okay. Anarchy, State, and Utopia is the title. Robert Nozick, 1974. And the message is there cannot be anything wrong with capitalist acts among consenting adults. The references to a certain section of criminal law, but what is basically saying is the logic of the market is legitimate. There cannot be anything wrong. Whatever the results are in terms of distribution, in terms of environmental effect of the market, it is legitimate. And objections are simply mistaken, philosophically inadmissible. Or Nobel Prize winning Milton Friedman, head of the Chicago school and advisor to the Pinochet government in Chile, quote, "The social responsibility of business is to make profit and nothing else," right? This are representative statements. Or Gary Becker, who uses market theorems for non-market phenomena. The intellectual imperialism of rational choice thinking originates also from these very years in the social sciences. Actors are conceptualized as atomistic rational utility maximizers, disembedded from social norms, institutions, and commitments to values such as justice. At the same time, we see the rise of a counter-movement of a communitarian antithesis with group-based commitments to identity politics and to non-translatable and non-universalizable identities of language, religion, ethnicity, or gender. And I see Michael Walzer as a previous speaker here. Michael Sandel is probably a better example of this counter-market doctrine that also came up with the market doctrine, but had nothing or very little to do with political. Final remark, in aesthetics, in the arts, in literature, in movies, in music, in architecture, you find a powerful movement of aesthetic postmodernism. Playful, anti-functionalist, self-referential, eclectic, relativistic, anti-classical, fixation on novelty as a intrinsic value. Boltanski and Chapello have written a famous book on this. In architecture, the main materials used are steel, glass, and concrete, as opposed to wood, rocks, and bricks, with the strategic difference being that the former had passed through a stage of fluidity in which they could easily be shaped, while the latter are solid by their very nature. You can curve glass very easily, or steel, and it's very different in the case of rock. Multiplication of media, the privatization and liberalization of media messages, also a political postmodernism in political economy, local decentralized flexible startups, ad hoc short-term shareholder value, capital as someone has said, has lost its patience. Long-term plans are out and considered obsolete. Flat hierarchies, playful, anarchic, consumerist individualism with innovation as the ultimate driver and value in itself. The self-description of the age of transformation, of change, of discontinuity, all starts with a post-Fordist, post-Keynesianism, postmodern, and post-materialist. The famous sociological school originated by Ronald Inglehart in 1977. The value changed from material, so-called post-materialist values. I think this self-description is quite accurate, and as a descriptor of the period in which we live since the mid-70s. Thank you very much. Sorry for going so long.
Thank you, Professor Raffa, for this fascinating lecture. I think it was very rich, multidimensional, and it is a great introduction to our conference. If anyone had doubts about the 70s as the shifting point, now I think he's convinced.
Okay, that was the purpose.
Yeah. And now we can ask Professor questions. I will be an operator of the microphone.
I want to ask you, because we are always asked to ask, perhaps we should go into discussions at the point.
Yeah,
Sure,
it
sure.
can be
No, we
discussed.
have
Yeah,
it.
of
It's not
course.
your fault. We have it always. There are thousands of things, you know, which I want to ask you. Thousands of things, you know. Because one thing really I do not know, because you had these 3 levels of which you told us, but where are the dependencies of what causes what? That's the point. Because I agree with, I have it in, I was studying in Berlin, 68, 69.
Okay.
So I remember all this it's a review of the end of the Vietnam War and so on. But what causes what? For example, it is said that the industry in Germany, after 45, is always said to be completely distracted. It was not distracted. There have been areas in Germany untouched. When the American army went from France to Munich, they didn't find any destroyed village. We only have pictures about the destroyed Hamburg and Dresden, but in the outskirts, 80% was all right. Volkswagen took over the same management even. Then they got...
I did not
I did
claim
not.
the opposite.
No, it's not.
You're absolutely
Not
right.
against
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
It's not, I try to
Yeah.
find a line, how to explain for myself what was really going on. So I have the feeling that the losers of the war, like Japan, like Germany, had a much better start. And it was not only the American problem, how was it called? The Marshall Plan was not so important because it causes food and so on. But the real important thing of the position of Germany was the not distraction of the old production. Maybe, I don't know. We have, because you said we had a boom in economy. I mean, this boom in economy we had mostly in countries with a big state factor industry. Sweden, Austria, 50%. The first was state-owned, and this was the most stable countries. For example, Southern Italy never developed. Spain was a disaster. Areas in France were La France profonde. It was terrible. England was ruined completely, not by destruction, but by their best dependencies on the United States. They really had a much worse situation now. So it is not so clear what causes. I think we cannot say that there was a 30-year-old boom everywhere. It was just on.
Okay, it's a German bias in this.
Yes, I think we have. I'm Austrians. I
Okay.
think we have always a look from our point of view. Normally, you have. So, only 2 things more. I think. What do you think about? I have a feeling that I'm looking for some evidence that it was the elites, the political and social elites, who had their interest in a certain development. And I don't know whether we have to do with inner logical contradictions or developments, or it was we are victims to a certain extent of an elite who were representing their interests. It is said that in France, after the French Revolution, always the same 300 families governed the country, whenever. And they were looking for their best. And I think it never changed. So how this goes together with social and economic development, I don't know. One last point is, perhaps, I remember very much when Kodak, I think it was Kodak and Rollei, when they moved from Germany to Asia, because it was possible to take the whole factory and to put it there. Because Krupp or Mercedes, you couldn't deliver to Singapore because you needed the workcraft. You needed the education of the people.
The workforce, yeah.
The workforce. And suddenly, I think it was around about in the 70s, when it was possible to bring over the whole the whole industry to undeveloped country and makes the work. And this was the question of the trade unions lost their importance because they couldn't, because there were always blackmails, and if you don't cooperate, so we go abroad and so on. So a lot of things was, sorry.
No, let me just...
you should react,
well,
not respond.
Yeah. Well, I mean, lots of things to say on this. One, the automobile industry, I mean, Germany, the German situation, and I explicitly speak about the German situation, and the French is different, and the Italian is different. So, if you go into the details, we need to draw these distinctions. The first point you address, industry was not really, the productive capacity was not really destroyed. What was destroyed is transportation lines and bridges, right? And that took a while to rebuild. And I could say, slightly cynically, not only were many things not destroyed, but many things were destroyed, and that turned out to be beneficial, right? For the design of a automobile-friendly urban structure, right? Look at the city of Hanover,
Okay.
and look at the social democratic doctrine of the social democratic government of the transportation minister by the name of Leber in 1974. He said, our aim is to make sure that 90% of the German people live no more than 10 minutes by car from the next autobahn entry. I mean, with the automobile industry, Germany still being the only country where you have no speed limit in Europe. You can go 200 kilometers per hour, and of course that fits nicely to the high quality cars that are being built in the Stuttgart area, and so this is all connected. So apart from this, I think what was pervasive throughout Europe and not specific to Germany, and I admit to having a bias because I know more about Germany than about any other country, that the idea of planning, in French planification, of long-term objectives, of corporatism, that is a tripartite or bilateral non-market cooperation of labor and capital at the state. This comes to an end in the second half of the 70s. And that in response to a crisis that is only superficially triggered by the oil crisis, although that played a big role, right? That was a shock and led to the phenomenon of stagflation. But it was also a situation where the growth potential of the welfare state model was exhausted. And new industries, new technology was needed in order to provide investment opportunities, however, without full employment. We have never had full employment. Just one figure, and then I stop. And the figure is 2.3% in February of the year 1970. The official registered unemployment rate was 2.3%. And that was considered at the time as catastrophic, because it has never been that high since the currency reform of the late 40s. It has been reduced throughout the 50s, and then it was 0.5%, right, with very expansionary effects on wages, and then it increased to 2.3%.
I think it was a million, no? It's this famous 1 million of unemployed, which I think it went around.
No, I mean in Germany.
In Germany, yeah,
I
remember that.
in February, which is the high point of unemployment anyway. And that led to the perception of a catastrophic change of conditions. And so the common denominator in the development of the major European economies was the feeling it cannot go on as we have had it after the war. We are entering a new age, and an age that is much more difficult than the previous age.
But do you think that the feeling has an importance to the development?
Yeah, but there are good reasons for having that feeling. Because, I mean, there's the crisis of the end of 1973 was very important, and the feeling of saturation of a growth period, it has the potential has been exhausted, and no one knows what is coming now. And the structural changes that I have mentioned, tertiary sector, service industry, decline of union strengths, and the other things.
I think we have the possibility to ask or discuss one or two more things.
I don't have 1,000 questions, I have just two. So the first one is, it's talk a bit about this, but the 70s were also a time when the discourse about the limits of growth emerged.
Okay, yeah.
And there were many...
I skipped this, yeah.
Yes, but that seems...
From 1970.
Yes, but also books like The Small is Beautiful, André Gold's political, Schumpeter, André Gold's political thought, so that seems to be some sort of surpassed, alternative. Neoliberal term. I think to what extent do you think that this is the experience we should rethink, or there is something to be learned from that, or that was simply, whether there's a possibility to return to that kind of discourse. So that's the one question. The second question, I think about the similarities of your argument or your narrative to a recent book by Wolfgang Streeck, Buying Time. He basically makes a similar point to the one you're making about the breakdown of democratic capitalism as something that really started in the 70s, but he seems to pay less attention to culture, politics, international relations. For him, it looks like internal contradictions of capitalism are being simply played out since that time. I wonder whether you would like to comment about similarities and differences between your approach and his. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, when the book Meadows, The Social Limits to Growth, came out in 1997.
That was Hirsch, actually. Social Limits to Growth was probably Fred Hirsch's book. The Rama Meadows was like a limit to growth.
Limits to Growth,
yeah.
yeah,
To growth.
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
The Social Limits to Growth is Fred Hirsch.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that is misquotation. Okay, when that came out in 1972, if I'm not mistaken, then I remember a conversation I had with an American colleague, and we both agreed that this may well be a sour grapes effect. The prediction of something that is not to be had anyway, right? And it fed into the beginning awareness of environmental and ecological and energy crisis. I mean, one little indicator is that Willy Brandt, who was a really independent mind, who had a deep knowledge of many problems that other people were unaware of, he in '73 spoke of the vision of having blue skies over the Ruhr Valley, right, in the core industrial region of West Germany. And we thought this is a bit overly visionary that we ever have blue skies in this dirty part of the country. Well, today there is no iron and steel industry to speak of anymore in the region, and there is blue sky. So it was a awareness of, again, the limits that we have to adjust to or to comply with, and that it would be difficult to continue a path of industrial expansion. Although even at that time, in the mid-70s, the international observers would say Germany is already over-industrialized. They have, which is still the case by comparison to the United States and other places. That is, the number of industrial production jobs versus service jobs is greater than it should be. But again, the sense of discontinuity that was feeling triggered by all these observations, the pessimistic observation that planning does not work, corporatism does not work, traditional industries and ways of running things need to be reconsidered, and cultural styles are changing, political challenges are increasing. We cannot have everything. We have to economize on expenditures, and so this slightly gloomy feeling of a model is running out and we do not know what the new one will be is also perceptible in the German case, and much more dramatically in Britain. And the eventual takeover of Margaret Thatcher, where the model of punishing labor for not working prevails throughout the entire period. The coal industry was killed and the public sector was shrunk, and so on. So the transition is greater in Britain than in Germany, and also in Italy. The change is clearly perceptible, although delayed. I would say it comes in Italy only in the late 80s, but then with particular intensity.
So maybe last one, let's call it intervention. Maybe
this was actually supposed to be a question, and quite
so go on.
a complicated one. But yeah, I'll try to put it shortly. You started saying that there is the oil crisis, which is a direct reason for the overall crisis of the capitalist system, of the phenomenon of stagflation, and the starting point for dismantling of the old school welfare states and the Keynesian policies of the post-war period. My question is, do you think that the reasons for the fact that the return on capital and return on investment in the Western capitalism in the 60s, that the reasons for that were somehow structural, or were there sort of just a consequence of a like mistaken policy? Let's say, if there would be no war in Vietnam, then maybe the American good society and the other stuff could survive. So, do you see any sort of say structural reasons that made the Trente Glorieux, or these glorious 30 years, that made them condemned to vanish and to disappear?
Okay. Yeah. I wish I had a clear and demonstrably true answer to the question. I think the two considerations point into the direction of a structural causation rather than a policy mistake, which is the other you posed. One is the argument that I've implicitly used in the influential book, 1973 book by James O'Connor, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, where he predicts the growing debt finance of public expenditures for both growth stimulating and social peace preserving policies. Right? That is one important, and that becomes unsustainable, and therefore the so-called non-productive social expenditures must be cut. And the cutting of social expenditures, the economizing on social expenditures, is the main theme that drives the demise of social democracy also. I mean, if you cannot spend, why vote for social democrats, right? If saving, economizing, fiscal austerity is the command of the moment, then we try to turn to individual processes of prosperity increases rather than collective. We do not join unions, we do not vote for social democratic parties. Footnote, we do not have children, because that also increases income per person, right? And that is the new mood that is resulting from this fiscal dilemma. That is the major structural causation. And then the other major structural causation is, I mean, in Marxian terminology, the growing organic composition of capital. Production becomes automated. High wages lead to incentives to adopt labor-saving technology, because labor is so expensive. It will hit a ceiling where, and I remember seeing the first factory where refrigerators are automatically manufactured. That was in 77, 78, in a famous manufacturer of household machinery, such as refrigerator. And there was a line, there was not a single worker on the line. There was one at the beginning, one at the end. That was the early version of labor-saving automation, followed by permanent unemployment and workfare policies as we know them today. So, public finance and efficiency enhancing labor replacing changes in industrial organization are the two structural causes that drive change.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you for great lecture. And we see all tomorrow on the conference. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo za udział w wykładzie, za wysłuchanie wykładu i za dyskusję. I zapraszam jutro, zaczynamy od 10:00 w konferencji. Jutro bierze udział m.in. Marcin Zaręba, Michał Suchowski, Przemek Sadura. Komentować będzie pierwszą sesję profesor Klaus Opfe. Potem wystąpi Agnieszka Kościańska, Justyna Jaworska. Zapraszam Państwa serdecznie. Dziękuję za dzisiaj. Do zobaczenia.
Yeah, I try to cover all aspects. Yeah.